Welcome to Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com, as well as the mobile app. He's Paul Dottino. I'm Lance Medow with you for the next 60 minutes. There's a special edition as we get ready for the Scouting Combine in Indianapolis. And as a reminder, you can find the archive of this show and our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. So all 32 teams' focus will turn to Indianapolis. We're not going to be able to take your phone calls throughout the course of this program, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to unravel all of the major NFL storylines that will be coming to the forefront. And who better to dig deep into those storylines than a man who has been covering the NFL for decades, a colleague of mine on Sirius NFL Radio. He covers the league now in the Buffalo Bills for WGRZ-TV in Buffalo, none other than Vic Carucci. Vic, long time no talk. We only spoke about a few days ago, but it's good to see you. Greatly appreciate the time. How's everything on your end?
Everything's great, and always enjoy the chance for us to work together on Sirius and pretty much any platform, but great to be with you. Great to be with you, Paul.
Absolutely. Vic, I want to start with the Giants connection before we branch out, because you have a very unique background that could perhaps provide some insight in terms of Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll's approach, because you saw firsthand what Brandon Beane and the two of them did in Buffalo. Not to say Daniel Jones and Josh Allen are equivalent resume-wise, but Allen did get an extension after a breakout third year in the NFL in 2020. Jones, it took a little bit longer, but he's coming off by far his most productive year within the confines of this offense. What did you see in Buffalo in terms of their approach with Josh Allen and the patience and what they saw in that third year that may indicate what Schoen and Daboll's thinking is in terms of a new contract for Daniel Jones?
Yeah, so the biggest difference, I think, that needs to be brought up in the discussion of any comparison is that, of course, when the Bills drafted Allen in 2017, Brandon Beane and Joe Schoen was, of course, part of that staff, that personnel staff, but they were focused, and Brandon was singularly focused that he had his guy as the franchise quarterback for many years to come. That they obviously moved up, made sure they were snagging him as they did, 7th overall pick. It was the year of that quarterback draft, 2018, and they identified him as being, in their mind, head and shoulders above the rest. And when I say they, especially Brandon Beane. So when you start with that foundation of the group that's going to be with him right along, that's a big factor relative to your future plans, because your commitment is already established. In the case of the Giants, that commitment really wasn't and couldn't have been realistically in place when Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll took over that program. They had to see what they had. He was there. They inherited him, but that's a far different story than picking him. So start with that. And then in terms of how it evolved, it was a case where incremental steps were made from 18 forward with Josh Allen. Had in many ways a typical kind of rookie year, was not thrown on the field immediately, but eventually gets out there and takes the lumps that go with being a rookie. And then the 19 season, you saw more progress, but you also saw a guy in the playoffs kind of did a little bit of a meltdown at Houston because he just wasn't ready for that, got into the hero ball thing, all of that. But nonetheless, they saw the progress. And then in 20, as that, after that 19 season and into 20, there was still the feeling that he's the guy, to the point where they were doing the anticipatory thing with him. And then, of course, he's taken off like a rocket in the 20 season to do that extension with him. There was never a doubt about that, about committing to him long term. Obviously, the doubts were lingering there with Daniel Jones. But the plus side of that story is you have a guy that they inherited, but a guy who proved himself unequivocally, I think, to them, that they had something to work with. I think they thought that. I'm not trying to share that I know this intimately, because how could I know, and how could they say that realistically before this past season? But here's a guy who took that opportunity to convince new evaluators what he's about.
Vic, let's stick with Daniel Jones for a second. A lot has been made here in the New York market, specifically by the fan base, about the fact that he just recently changed agents right in the middle of this negotiation. Now, you and I have been around this game a long time, Lance too. We know that agents will be changed in and out on kind of a frequent basis, and there can be a lot of reasons for that. It doesn't necessarily mean that Daniel Jones is being greedy, wants more money, and is going to have a harder time getting the deal done, does it?
I don't think so, Paul. I think it has more to do with a longer vision of how his career is being managed. I think there's many reasons a player will make such decisions. And it doesn't always just come down to, well, this representative will get me more money than that representative. Agents, and it wasn't like he was working with someone who was new or green to the situation. Agents know the market. It's spelled out so plainly to all of us. You don't have to be an agent to understand what the market is, for instance, for a quarterback or any position, because you're bombarded with that information. It's accessible to all of us, right? So I think it had maybe much more to do with a plan, a longer term plan, how to approach the negotiation, say, and the structure of not only how these talks would go, but again, how a deal would be put together that spoke to how Daniel Jones, who I get the sense, I'm not going to pretend like I know how his mind works, but I think he's a thinker. I think he's someone who has ideas, true ideas of how he wants to sort of see it. And it feels to me like he found the common ground with new representation.
Vic, speaking of the financial dynamics, as you're well aware, I think from the fan standpoint, when it comes to a team negotiating with a quarterback, the common sense is, well, the quarterback should do everything in his power to look out for the health of the salary cap and make sure there's some money left over so the team can actually surround him with talent. And I think that's obviously a big conversation for the Giants as they look to upgrade the wide receiver core and the skill positions around Daniel Jones. You've been covering various different negotiations. Josh Allen, when he got his deal, once again, not to say it was equivalent to Daniel, but he set a new bar with guaranteed money, and he was right up there with Mahomes, right, in terms of average annual salary. What I'm getting at is, how much do you think the onus is on a high-profile position like a quarterback to say, I've got to look out for myself, but I also, most importantly, need to look out for the well-being of the GM and the cap expert's job of looking out for what's left over salary cap-wise?
Honestly, I don't think it's something the player can really worry himself with. And I'm not trying to suggest be selfish, go get all you can for you. But you do get potentially only one bite at this apple. And it's an incredible apple for any player, but especially for that quarterback position. You need to go into it first and foremost with the thoughts of what is going to be best for you, for your value, and especially when it's your first opportunity. This is a different discussion if you're, and how many times with Tom Brady and the Patriots was there that sense that as he was going on to contracts 2, 3, or 4, however many it was in the time, 20-something years, that's multiple contracts, and it's rare. If a player gets a second contract, that's a big deal, and that might be it. But it's a different deal where now that quarterback is looking at the surrounding situation. He obviously wants to be there. He senses something's been built to give long-term sustainable success. Daniel Jones and the Giants are still in the early stages of all of this. Yes, they had a great first year, but there is much more work to do. And, the growth of the head coach is right with this, Brian Daboll. The growth of Joe Schoen as a GM. I mean, these are experiences that they're having now and building upon. And of course, they've got to see the big picture. But for Daniel Jones' sake, his position, I think, should be, it's your job to figure out, your being the GM, coach, ownership, whatever, figure out how the bigger picture looks, and then how my deal fits into it with my value. I find it hard to think that he would say, well, let's hold me down here to make sure all these pieces are around, because how could he really know how it's going to come together? I think time has to speak to that. So I think this contract would very likely be to the level of, if there's an agreement. I mean, they reach an agreement, and I think they're going to, but I mean, I think the agreement is going to be very much one where he doesn't have the misgiving of leaving money on the table, because, well, it's great for the team. He wants the best for the team, and he wants to find that success. But it's on them. I think, it's on the people whose job is to handle that, to figure it out.
Well, part of the way to figure that out, Vic, is obviously using the franchise tag, whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive. From your perspective and talking to people around the league, what is the value or the market of a Daniel Jones? Should the Giants not be able to sign him to a multi-year contract and have to use the tag? Let's suppose it's the non-exclusive, which then allows him to talk to other people. What kind of interest do you think he's going to draw?
Well, I would, first of all, I think they're going to protect their asset here. You don't mess with a quarterback you think is your guy, because the question you have to answer when you ask that question, who are they going to get? Who is the alternative to what they have? I don't see one. I think it is Daniel Jones or bust. But if Daniel Jones had been a bust in the 2022 season, okay, you're still back at the drawing board. I mean, they did not go into 2022, at least to my way of seeing it from the outside, with the idea that they knew he was going to be what he was. You don't pick up obviously that option year with the idea that you better prove it. Well, he did his part. So now it's up to you to finish the rest of that story, which is figuring out how to best protect your rights to him, try to figure out a deal. All a tag does, and I don't see anything other than the exclusive one, is kicks the can down the road for you to just buy time and give you a chance to find that right number. And as far as that number goes, Paul, I think it's all about the marketplace, and as it's defined by guaranteed money. We will get caught up in the average number and make a big deal about that. And what does that average number mean? It doesn't mean a thing, because as over the course of 6 years or 10 years, however long that, and obviously the longer the deal, the more you're able to make it cap friendlier and give you options going forward. That's the purpose of that. But it's what that player wants, what his representation is going to encourage, is guaranteed money. And then what are the comps? And you have a Derek Carr negotiating now, different spots comparing him with Daniel Jones, but it's going to be in the discussion. I don't want to necessarily say Lamar Jackson is any kind of comparison, just because of how those negotiations have gone, and if we're hearing the right things about the amount of guaranteed money that's been offered him. But this is also a guy who's been an MVP, a guy who has much more in the way of accomplished career. But at the very, I don't know if he's at the very top, but what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers? We're going to see quarterback movement that is going to influence how quarterback payment is seen. And yes, you have different discussions with players at different phases, but here's the common thread. He's your franchise guy. What is a franchise guy worth to your franchise?
Especially if the alternative option is the land of the unknown in the draft. As you could see, Vic, I mean, you go back to Josh Allen's class, for example. I love to bring up this as one that puts things in perspective. There were 4 teams, Vic, that picked in the top 10 in 2018. They all went in thinking we're going to find our franchise guy, right? The Browns take Baker Mayfield. The Jets take Sam Darnold. The Cardinals take Josh Rosen. The Bills, Josh Allen. Allen's the last one standing. I know Lamar went later on in the first round, but 4 teams thought they would have a solidification at the most important position. And we're talking, 5 years down the road, you got 3 teams back to square one.
Exactly. I mean, it is pretty amazing how it worked out, and how it just shows you, Lance, how teams see things differently. Scouting staffs. There is no set formula. I mean, I think there's wisdom to be gained in studying what some of the best have done and what Hall of Famers who pick players have done. But the evolution of this sport, especially at the college level, I think has made it more difficult. And then when you deal with program sizes, and I think the real wild card with Josh, for instance, Wyoming, a program that didn't have a lot of refined quarterback coaching or passing game, and he was raw as could be, and it was up to Brandon Beane, up to the personnel staff, Sean McDermott, everybody who had a voice in it, to see beyond the rawness and have that vision of what the NFL Josh Allen would ultimately look like. And I'll tell you what, and you know this, Paul knows this, through the first couple of years, it was, he's looking a lot like that rough, inaccurate guy. And it's amazing. He's going to go down, I think, as one of the amazing stories as someone who took college inaccuracy and became far more accurate as a pro. It generally doesn't happen. That's at least been a rule of thumb. It can, I mean, if you give it the 10,000 hours and all of that, and he did, worked with Jordan Palmer, worked with Brian Daboll, worked with Ken Dorsey, who and something else for Josh, they weren't the first two. He had he had new coaching. I mean, that changed in the time that he was with the Bills. And here Daboll comes along that one year at Alabama, where I think he learned a lot about RPO game, how he incorporated that with Josh's rushing skills. Those were all transformative and helpful things. I'm not saying they were the secret sauce to Josh being what Josh is. That's Josh. That's his talent. And it also had to be his willingness to work at it. And it applies to Daniel Jones. It applies to every quarterback. But let's talk about Jones. The other decision, or I should say the other big factor in the decision process that the Giants are going to make is seeing beyond 2023, seeing 5, 6, 10 years down the road. Because when you put that kind of money into it, and this is a commitment to a quarterback that this franchise hasn't made in a long time, right, guys? That you do that. I mean, you're still, it's still risky and it's still a guessing game. I mean, it's not foolproof, but you'd better have a lot of confidence that he is not only going to just blossom because he's been blessed to blossom, it's because he's responding to the coaching. He understands what you want, what you see, and what you're going to get out of him, and that this is a combined long-term marriage of coach and quarterback.
Vic, let me go from the franchise quarterback to the franchise running back. And as you know, many people have now lessened the value of a franchise running back because they talk about his longevity capabilities and his durability. And the durability factor does come into play with Saquon Barkley. Obviously, had a couple of devastating injuries. He's come back from them. He's done well. But there will be those who say, well, if you have to use the tag on Daniel Jones, that creates a real conundrum because now you've got to find an appropriate value for a running back who has shown the ability to get hurt, but also bounce back from injury. This becomes a very sticky situation, which is obviously why the Giants would rather tag Barkley than Jones.
Right. I that's the way I would see it too. Again, easy to say from the outside, but it feels like every effort to get a long-term deal done with the quarterback should be job one, AAA. And it should be done too with, it's going to be done too with the bigger picture of how then your cap is going to look to do other things. And the Barkley situation, it is interesting because when healthy, we know the value. And by the way, Daniel Jones knows that value too. He is a better quarterback, just like any other quarterback. When you've got some kind of running threat, I don't see though the model that say the Titans have tried to use with the whole Derrick Henry being their most important and best player and carrying the load for them. I think that only gets you so far. I don't think it works in today's NFL, and this just in, right? But you better have that guy under center or behind center, and you better and then everything else better complement that. And it does feel to me like you could even move on from a Saquon Barkley. And I don't want that to sound blasphemous for Giants fans who are saying, what is he, crazy? I don't think it's crazy if you can identify well enough, either in this draft, free agency, or I should say like undrafted free agent. Running backs can be acquired and can be good for you. And as long as you got the other components, how much trust do you have in your O-line to give you some kind of a consistent presence of running game balance? So you have to look at it, I think, through a broader lens.
I'm glad you went there, Vic, even though maybe the fans don't want to think about that hypothetical. I'll go there with you to the dark side about perhaps the viewpoint of life without Saquon Barkley. And maybe not an ideal comparison, but Buffalo's usage of running backs, as you can attest to, sometimes a bit of a head scratcher. Sometimes we've seen them completely abandon the run game. And let's face it, when Shane was there under Brandon Beane, you talk about Devin Singletary, Zach Moss. It's not like they went out, Vic, my point is, and really invested high resources into that position. Now, in fairness, I don't think they ever had a guy with Saquon's skill set. So maybe it's a little bit different. But how much do you think Brandon Beane's viewpoint, the organization's viewpoint of how they attack the running game, now influences how he thinks about whether or not Saquon's worth a second contract?
I think it will have some influence. For sure, because a lot of what he's applying, he learned there. But he's his own man. Joe Schoen is his own man for sure. Let's make that very clear. He's learned from others. I mean, it wasn't just Brandon Beane as his mentor, and it wasn't like I got to be him or do everything exactly as he did it. That just the Joe Schoen I know doesn't really operate that way at all. He's got a lot of independent thought, as he should. And he was hired for that reason. I mean, I don't think you hire a clone, and if you hire someone who gives you that impression, you're going to be disappointed because he probably isn't the person he's trying to imitate, and he's not himself. So let's get that out of the way. But as far as running back philosophy and the position, the Bills are still struggling to figure that out. It's Devin Singletary, in all likelihood, I think they're going to let him walk. Could he end up as a Giant? Maybe he does. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if you want to see touchstones between the Giants and the Bills. That could be one, along with possibly others that are for a team that's about 16 million over the cap. There's gonna be a lot of moving on from people. There has to be for them to get under the cap, and that's got to happen soon. So I think the Bills still need to address it. Running back could factor into what they do in this draft, or again in free agency, undrafted free agency, something, because they've got James Cook, but they need a slammer. They need somebody with more power and explosiveness. So that's still a lingering thing, and it speaks to the improvement of that. The necessity there speaks to how much more they're going to get out of Josh Allen. How much better he can be when he's got that running game, and how much of a struggle he had, especially through the second half of last year, where that running game was waning, and the line comes into play with that as well. So I think it's more of a blanket thought here than a specific one, but I think the Giants, obviously, Joe Schoen, Daboll, would be looking at the running back position. You've got, when healthy, one of the very best, but you can't rely on that consistent health, availability, and the cost that goes with a veteran. And I think the ceiling gets busted through very much quicker with running backs we've seen. And look at the entire landscape of the league. Who has that, quote, franchise back? Tennessee Titans, okay. Vikings got a pretty good guy in Dalvin Cook. You can go down the list and find some good ones and some teams that have some really good running backs. But tell me a team that's more reliant on that than their quarterback. Not many, none.
Maybe San Francisco.
Well, San Francisco, but that was out of necessity too. That came out, right. I mean, you're right. I won't discount San Francisco, absolutely, and the Kyle Shanahan scheme, but that was tailored to what they had or didn't have. And that was just such a crazy year. They didn't know that. I guess you'd argue they didn't know their quarterback going into the year, let alone what they had to have when they were into the postseason.
They also used multiple guys too, as opposed to just one, even though they just got Christian McCaffrey.
Exactly. Yes.
Vic, the other position that kind of fits into this equation for the Giants at wide receiver, they don't have an alpha at receiver. And we know that when Daboll was the offensive coordinator up in Buffalo and Shane was part of that front office, they went and made a big deal with draft capital to get Stephon Diggs. The Giants need an alpha receiver. How do you suppose their inclination's going to be to get one?
Well, you better. I mean, you got to have that guy. Where do you get him? I think you think draft. This appears to be one where there are some good players that are going to be available. However you maneuver to do that, how much of a priority do you put on that? But I think that has to be high on the list. And that is something obviously that Joe saw from Daboll, from the Bills, and how transformative that was to Allen. First, identify that you got the guy that can throw the rock and make that asset at receiver good. It's not the other way around. You have to have step one is quarterback, step two is the receiver, I think. And they know, and I believe they think that way. But yeah, when Stephon Diggs came aboard and what they gave up, and Bean's thought process on that was he was our first round pick that year when they didn't have a first round pick. They, giving up the high asset to get him, they felt was worth everything, and it's proven to be, because he's been their best. Now their problem is they don't have a second best. Honestly, they're lacking the drop off from him, which they didn't think would be as great, but seemed to manifest itself as Gabe Davis did not deliver the way they thought he would.
Especially after that huge performance against the Chiefs in the playoffs the previous year. A related note to that, Vic, I think we've had this conversation on this program. If you don't re-sign the explosive running back and you look to then replace that in the passing game, which I think the Bills come into play here. Okay, you didn't have a dominant running back. You got it, though, in the form of wide receiver. We saw what A.J. Brown did for the Philadelphia Eagles. They did the same thing you're talking, right? You take the land of the unknown, the draft pick, you turn it into a proven commodity. Personally, I love that philosophy. I would take that every single year. But what I'm getting at is if the Giants turn the focus more, to your point, Daniel Jones, we're a believer in his arm. We want the offense now to transition more from the ground to his aerial attack. Can you flip the switch, you think, in the span of a season where the wide receiver, if you make the splash, comes in and can make up for what maybe you're lacking in the backfield?
That's a great one. I think yes, mostly. I don't know that it's a full transformation, but it should be in their thought process, because again, when the investment changes in the quarterback, and let's just, for the sake of this conversation, assume that's going to be the case. It's going to work out and Daniel Jones is going to have a franchise level contract. Well, then other decisions you make to make sure you're maximizing that investment go in line with that. And yes, I think being more of a throw, not only a throwing offense, an offense that, and Daboll does believe in balance, but as Josh Allen ascended, you saw what they did. They became a Josh first offense. It wasn't just a pass first offense. It was a Josh first offense, because Josh also has that running dimension. And you saw a lot of that with Ken Dorsey as the OC this year, maybe even more so, but it should be it should be related to that. And then the balance of the offense has to come in the form of, utilizing maybe the kind of receivers that can also give you jet sweep help, all the things that I know Daboll knows about that, and utilized to some extent with Isaiah McKenzie, but he didn't really have I'm going to say Deebo Samuel, Montgomery, those we've seen those dimensions that can be put into an offense as a receiver / runner hybrid. But he's open-minded enough to know that you've got to evolve. And this offense, this Giant offense, just like his offense in Buffalo, and it should happen with each team, is, and it doesn't, I guess, but it should evolve. You should see different things about this. We should be having a conversation in the course of the season where we say, wow, this is look at the Giants offense now. They're doing this, and this. Obviously, you'll have a better conversation if it's successful, but I think you are going to see some transformation there, no doubt.
That really fingers off into the area I wanted to go in with you, Vic. I want to ask you about Brian Daboll. You know him so well from his time with the Bills and you being up there. In retrospect, how surprised are you that he was able to turn this Giants team around so quickly, win a bunch of Coach of the Year awards, and how well do you think he is suited to continue growing over the long term and sustain this success?
I would be lying if I said I wasn't surprised because the challenge seems so great. And when I say that, it's not because I doubted Brian's ability to be an effective and good head coach. I thought he'd bring all that knowledge and all that skill to the table, but what did he have to work with? And like, I want to speak for you, but like you, like Lance, like so many others, I had no clue what the quarterback thing was going to be. And that's what it all came down to. He'll show incremental improvement the team will make some incremental improvement, but then it'll have a limit and they're going to have to still figure the quarterback thing out. And then I became worried for him because I said, you only get so much time to prove yourself as a coach. What happened with him was amazing, more because what he did with Jones and what he did with this offense. And I know he won't take all the credit. It's spread out. But it speaks to how ready he was for this challenge, even more so than those of us who know him and support what he does. And I loved on regularly on either Sunday nights or Monday, we had our text exchanges after a Giants win and the congrats and all this and happy for you and all and it got to be a thing. Like I felt like I said, okay, I did this once and twice. Then I said, how many more times am I going to do it? Hell, it ended up being a lot, and it was great. It was enjoyable because you root for that. He's got that earthy, that basic, relatable thing, and I'm not from Buffalo, but spent most of my life in the Buffalo area, and he speaks to that as a true Western New Yorker that so many people could embrace. So you had all the fever of the Bills, but you had going along right with that the joy and support for Brian Daboll.
Vic, I want to piggyback off of the dynamics that were in play last season, because I think what also jumps out to me in retrospect is the way the Giants went about the hiring process, bringing in Joe Schoen, and then Shane ultimately bringing in somebody he has familiarity with. And you've seen this from around the league. When you have that strong rapport between GM and head coach, and I think you could say it's true in Buffalo, Brandon Beane, Sean McDermott, how that really can maybe accelerate the development of your roster when two individuals are in line with one another. And, this is a big offseason for Joe Schoen. This is really his first opportunity to put his stamp on this team in conjunction with what Daboll envisions they want to run on offense and defense, and how critical you think looking back that was to maybe have them a bit ahead of the curve than most people had anticipated.
Oh, you nailed it, Lance. You have to have the singular common vision of coach and GM, and it is not as easy as one might think. And I don't know if people think it's easy, but I think it's easy to sort of look back and say, well, okay, well, that's what they're supposed to do. The head coach, the GM, they got to work together. GM gets some players, coaches them, and they know what they want. No, it doesn't always work out that way. And show me where it fails in the NFL. And again, we could find any number of situations through history, and I could show you either full out dysfunction or at least a level of disconnect between coach and GM. That didn't exist with the Giants. Those two came in together with an understanding of what the program would look like and the time they spent in the same building in Buffalo, what they were part of, what they saw, made it a lot easier. It's not about working with your buddy. It's about working with someone you trust and whose thinking aligns with what you want done. That's really the key to all of this, because there should also be disagreement. It's healthy. Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott worked together in Carolina. Obviously had a relationship that was built there. And yes, the dotted line was drawn as soon, like when McDermott was hired first in 2007 in January, and then Beane comes along a little bit later, but it wasn't necessarily as automatic as people thought, even though so many said, well, Beane will end up following him to Buffalo, which he did. But you would later find out that Beane separately had his interview with ownership, showed his ideas that made them believe he was the right hire. And then beyond all that is, in fact, I even had a conversation with him that Beane, where he admitted publicly, he said, look, if it went the other way around, I couldn't guarantee you that I would have automatically said Sean should be our coach. He'd be on the list. I'd consider him, but he'd be looking at this wide lens of coaching possibilities, because if they asked me, ownership asked me as a GM to do that, I would. Now, their marriage has been, I think, highly successful. Obviously, the results on the field. They do disagree. They acknowledge the disagreements, but then they talk it out and ultimately find the right place to land on what needs to be done, I think, to have a successful team. And look, they're facing a challenge. Bouncing out of the playoffs yet another year is not the way they want this to go. There's a lot of pressure to finally see this thing through and figure it out. And they've got a lot of holes for a team that was a Super Bowl or bust team going into the 22 season. Man, after that loss to Cincinnati, it put a bright light on multiple areas that have to be fixed. Oh yeah, and you're $16 million over the cap right now.
Vic, final question for me, and I'm going to go off the Giants and go broad-based NFL question. As we begin the combine, put on your prediction cap here. What is going to be the biggest story that comes out of this week in Indianapolis?
I think traditionally it's always the contract discussions that are free agent contract discussions that are happening simultaneously with the activity of college talent evaluation. And this year, as much as, if not more than others, because of the quarterbacks involved. I think the news that's going to pop daily, probably beginning as early in the week as possible, Monday, Tuesday, will be, when the agents converge and they sit with those GMs, and if you've been to a combine, when you're walking through the hotel lobbies, and out of the corner of your eye, you're paying attention, but you're trying to not totally eavesdrop, but you see that you see that GM, you see that agent, and you know what they're talking about, you know what the topic is, and it's not about the weather in Indianapolis, and it's not about the hotel service. It's so that usually is what dominates. Well, I'm sure there will be a prospect story here and there that comes out. And, the other thing that might be something to watch, I don't think it'll dominate, but I think at least as an undercurrent, the comments that DeMaurice Smith made about the combine, right? When he spoke at the Super Bowl about it and really talked about it being something that either needs to be done away with altogether, which again, I don't think will happen, but needs to be refined and revised because he feels it's not the most dignified thing or dignified at all to have college players have their first introduction to the league be this, the intensive questions they get and all that. But the opposite end of that is teams are going to be making investments, want to know what they're investing in. And this is, one of the tools of that. I will say medically, the medical evaluation, and you guys have heard this too, everybody who's been involved in the NFL who's worth his salt says, if you got nothing else out of the week in Indianapolis, it is those medical results, the examinations that they get of injuries and so forth, or health issues that have been maybe hidden. And they've got a wonderful setup there with the Indiana University Medical Center and how it's all really convenient. I know there's been talk about moving the combine, but man, they've got like a really good condensed setup there that allows those to happen. And the information that's gleaned from that is what the teams, they said if they did away with everything else, the workouts, the TV show that comes out of it, give us that, they'd be happy with it. But But yeah, I think that's a secondary story to the headlines that we can expect about free agents, quarterbacks, whoever it might be, Carr, Rodgers, right down Lamar Jackson, right down the line.
The NFL cycle never slows down. 365 days, 24/7. And Vic Carucci knows that very well. You can hear him on Sirius XM NFL Radio. He covers the NFL and the Bills for WGRZ TV in Buffalo, and he will be in Indianapolis listening in to those agents and the conversations that may be happening over the next few days. Vic, always a blast. Pleasure. Greatly appreciate the time and the insight. I'm sure our fan base is certainly very happy to hear what you provided, perhaps that we could get a glimpse out of Buffalo, and definitely look forward to chatting in the near future here.
Safe travels, Vic.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure to be with both of you, and we'll talk down the line.
Thanks again to Vic Carucci, providing some great insight on what the Giants may do this offseason. So from this point on, we're going to transition to answering some of your Twitter questions, also go around the NFL and discuss some things that could very well impact the Giants and the NFC East. But first, a few reminders before we move forward here on Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. Make sure you go subscribe to the Giants Huddle podcast. It features a variety of different reactions from various guests, which we will turn our attention to over the course of the offseason. But during the season, we give you a full breakdown heading in to every matchup. Giants fans, take your fandom to the next level with a season ticket membership. Stay connected to the club all year round, not just on game days. Memberships are now available for the 2023 season. To learn more about all the exclusive member benefits, visit giants.com/tickets. Limited inventory is available. And last but not least, the Giants official connected TV streaming app, Giants TV, brings original video content and game highlights on demand and direct to Big Blue fans. Giants TV is free. It's on Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire TV, as well as the Giants mobile app. All right, Paul, let's open the conversation up to Twitter, #GiantsChat for the future. And we certainly will continue to monitor this throughout the offseason. We appreciate the interaction from all of our listeners and viewers. So this comes from Michael, and a very good question. With the exception of Wan'Dale Robinson, what guy coming off of IR is potentially the biggest contributor next season? And clearly, Paul, unfortunately, the Giants dealt with their fair share of injuries. We look at Wan'Dale Robinson with a lot of intrigue, but I'll start with you. Who else to you maybe is appealing that you think comes back and can put his stamp on this team?
Yeah, well, for me, it's really, really easy. It's Cincinnati linebacker Darian Beavers, who, was drafted in the 6th round last year, had such a terrific training camp. I loved him coming out of school. And I think the fact that he was so versatile with the Bearcats actually hurt his draft stock because they needed him in so many different places. And he was able to excel in all of those different places that he wasn't a master of one. And I think that's what hurt him. He would have been drafted a lot higher, I think, if they had just been able to leave him in one spot so that he could polish and develop his game as an alpha, so to speak. And that didn't happen. So the Giants get lucky, in my opinion, get him in the 6th round. He has a wonderful training camp. And in the preseason, he blows out his knee and has to go to IR for the year. For me, Lance, I really thought he had a quick ascension coming. I thought there was a real chance he might even be the starting inside linebacker opening day and maybe a couple weeks in, if not during week 1. I don't think it was going to be too long before he took that job. And even Joe Schoen after the season admitted that they thought that was a possibility. He seemed to certainly be on track to provide stiff competition, if not seize the spot himself. So hoping that his medicals are going really, really well. I don't know that. We haven't heard a word about him, but I hope they're going really well and that he hits the ground running at training camp. And wouldn't it be something to see him, in that starting lineup week 1? If not then, maybe a month in. Again, who knows? But I'd like to believe that Darian Beavers can be a significant contributor in 23.
And there's an opportunity, to your point, at that position, because he could come in and make an immediate impact. The other thing that's important to note, and you were alluding to this, remember, he spent time at 2 different colleges throughout his collegiate years. So, that, of course, adds up to versatility. But at the same time, it's hard to see where he would fit in because I think you saw half of the resume at UConn, half of the resume at Cincy, and you didn't necessarily know where that was going to click. So that adds an extra layer of intrigue if the Giants can get him back to full health and maybe tap into that skill set. Wan'Dale Robinson is the guy that would be atop my list, Paul, but I know that the tweeter said we can't utilize that. So for the sake of not repeating your player, because Beavers would be high on my list, here's another one I want to throw out, and I feel like it's somebody – not that most Giants fans and us who cover the team have forgotten about, but so much has happened since he got hurt. Aaron Robinson at cornerback. We've talked so many things throughout the season about the Fabian Moros and, right, all the other young guys, right, that stepped up, Paul. We forget Aaron Robinson is still on this roster. Unfortunately, clearly he was dealing with a knee issue, and hopefully he can recover, but I don't think the Giants are moving on from him. I think there's still potential. There's upside. He's young. We know he has the ability to maybe play inside and outside. They can use definitely another staple opposite of Dory Jackson. Robinson has shown some flashes from the time that he was on the field. So it's not as much projection as some of these other guys, maybe even a Wan'Dale Robinson who had a relatively small sample size. I'd sign up for Aaron Robinson, assuming he can turn the corner and get back to full health.
You know, Lance, I think that's a great pick as well because this is a guy who's a former third-round pick. So let's not make any bones about this. When they drafted him in the third round, they saw him as a potential competitive guy who could seize a starting spot. That's what you use your first 3 picks for in the draft. You want guys who could potentially be starters. So he was not a reach. This is a guy with length, with speed, with a knack for the ball. He's tough. He's willing to play the run. Look, I was saying all along when James Bradbury became a salary cap cut that I thought Robinson could be that guy to step up. I wasn't so devastated when the Giants didn't go and draft another high corner because I really thought Robinson was going to be the guy. And unfortunately, as we've documented, he got injured and his season was lost. Again, we believe his medicals now. We know a little bit about him because he was in the locker room during the course of the season. And he did have his procedure. And as far as he seemed to be telling us, everything was going according to plan, that he was optimistic, and he expects to be a full go at training camp. And so we'll see exactly where he's at. But I think that's a really good pick as well.
The other thing that's a common element, Paul, with the 3 players that we threw out here is all of these players were drafted. And what have we been talking about, Paul, right? If this team is continuing to progress in the right direction and have that stabilizing force, your draft classes, not 1 year's class, your multiple years have to all continue the trajectory of moving up. And that's what I can't overlook in discussing Beavers and Robinson and Aaron Robinson. We're not talking about players that have been here forever, not that far removed from the draft. If you can get them on the field, think about how much that alleviates what's on the plate of Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll in terms of what they have to go out and target in free agency.
I'll give you a dark horse guy here. I know the reader did not ask for one, but Dane Belton, who was nicked up this year and was unable to play the whole season, but we certainly saw enough from him to believe that he has some ups. Again, another draft choice from last season. And when you consider that Julian Love is an unrestricted free agent, we know the Giants are going to need to try to take care of Barkley and Jones. Julian Love says he wants to be here. The Giants obviously want him. They've already started talking to him. But what if that doesn't work out? And they've got to replace that safety spot next to Xavier McKinney. Well, Dane Belton, certainly Pinnock is certainly a guy who will have something to say about that. But Belton might wind up being the opening day starter.
And another player similar to Beavers who had that versatility coming from Iowa, they tapped into his skill set, moved him around. So, that's somebody that I think the fact that you got him exposure in year 1, and remember, he was dealing with the injury in training camp, came in. Paul, remember, he gets on special teams. He recovers a fumble early on in his career. Yeah, he seemed to make a really good, small, strong transition. So I think that bodes well for him in terms of what he could do in year 2. So that was my Twitter question. We did a tag team effort in preparing for the show. So the floor is yours now.
Oliver Shuniman wants to know, should the Giants take a look at free agent wide receiver Robert Woods? Now, this is a fellow who is a former 1,000-yard receiver in the league. He's been around with a few organizations. We know he is right now an unrestricted free agent after being cut by the Tennessee Titans. But, he's far removed from that 1,000-yard season that he had some years back. And we do know about the Buffalo connection with Shane and Dable, when he was in Buffalo. I get all of that. But in recent years, we've seen that decline in production. He's been around for a while. I would say that in a golf term, he's on the back nine. Only had about 50 catches last year and only averaged about 10 yards a catch. To me, the Giants need to add some size and some deep threat capability to that wide receiving core. And Woods, I think right now, for me, Lance, is more of a possession guy who would be lower on the depth chart. He's a savvy piece that maybe if somebody needs that fourth or fifth receiver to plug in to kind of fill out their chart, that's where he fits best for me. I don't think he necessarily should be a Giants target right now. In fact, if I were the Giants, I'd be looking at somebody, if you wanted to take a flyer here on a guy who's available right now, DJ Chark for me, who also is a former 1,000-yard receiver and has a higher average yards per catch these days, a lot younger, has also had some injuries. But that might be a guy who I'd be a little more inclined to take a look at.
Former Jacksonville Jaguar, was with the Lions last season. I think he gives you a little bit more of maybe what you're lacking currently in the receiving core. I think Robert Woods' dip in numbers, Paul, though, part of that is a product of the quarterbacks in Tennessee. Remember, Ryan Tannehill missed some time. So
Sure.
I don't know if I'd hold that all against him, but I would agree with you. I think if you look at the Giants receiving core right now, and we were talking about Wan'Dale Robinson coming back. Okay, well, there's a guy that could play out of the slot, right? So there's a little bit of carryover between him and Robert Woods. We don't know what's going to happen with a Richie James because he's a pending free agent. We don't know also, Paul, what's going to happen with Sterling Shepard, who's another player that was hurt. So, I mean, it's possible.
Or Darius Slayton.
Darius Slayton, too, but I look at him more of that size guy, stretch the field, not necessarily a slot guy. So what I was getting at is there may be an opportunity for somebody who does operate out of the slot to make an impact. It's possible, depending on what plays out. But if you look at need right now on paper, you need somebody that gives you a little bit more versatility in terms of going up, making those jump ball catches, those 50-50 contested catches, becomes a red zone threat. And I think that would probably best suit them. If you're going to go out and you're going to spend a little money, Paul, I guess is my point. You're going to utilize some of your resources. I think it's better suited doing that as opposed to bringing in somebody that overlaps with some of the current skill sets of the personnel in that receiving corps.
Yeah, I totally agree, because the question becomes, if you're Joe Shane, do you look more to upgrade the style of guys that you have and try to get more production that way? Or do you try to add production out of your receiving core by getting someone who has an alternate skill set?
Yep.
And that's where I'm thinking, and it sounds like you kind of feel the same way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also depends on how does this scheme evolve, Paul? Are they looking at their offense, assuming Daniel Jones is back, taking more chances down the field, which is where a deep threat, to your point, a guy that could stretch the field, comes in extremely to be beneficial? Remember, what is the one thing that the Giants were lacking in the passing game this past season? Explosive plays. Now, whether it comes on the ground or through the air, you need the high volume of 20-plus yard plays, because you can't expect to go down the field 10 plays, 80 yards every single drive and play clean football and avoid penalties. It's not feasible in today's NFL.
Well, again, we know that Slayton is a free agent, and he was the Giants' big play threat because he averaged over 15 yards a catch, which was among the top 10 in the league. In fact, for most of the season, he was in the top 5 of the league in average yards per catch based on qualifiers. But he is an unrestricted free agent, and we really don't know what their appetite is for bringing him back. I love what Isaiah Hodgins did over the second half of the season, but in a perfect world, he's your number 2 guy. He's not your number 1 guy. He's not your alpha who's going to be going 15 yards a catch and making those speed plays and stretching the field. In a perfect world, He's more like what Thielen was to Jefferson in Minnesota, if that makes any sense in terms of a comparison.
That's fair. Yeah. And Thielen, remember, was the number one guy before Jefferson came into the mix, but
Right.
things changed, roles changed. So Isaiah Hodgins really operated, Paul, right, as the number one guy this year. But if you improve the receiving core, it's understandable that there's movable parts and
He
things
should
change.
be a Robin, Lance. He should be a Robin, not a Batman.
Yes, the Batman. We've always had that conversation with pass rushers, right?
Yes,
You
we
want to
have.
have Batman and you want to have Robin. And sometimes it's not necessarily easy to be able to capitalize and gain both. I will say this. If we're talking about Robert Woods, Paul, to circle back and put a bow on this conversation in the context of he maybe is your fourth option, that's not a bad position to be in. Meaning you address perhaps the skyscraper. You have Hodgins, you have Wilder Robinson, and Robert Woods is a guy, you don't have to play him ultra snaps, but you bring him in. He's good insurance for injury. I mean, that's a great veteran presence to have in your locker room, too, at the end of the day.
And I guess I wouldn't discount it as long as they're able to fill that primary hole higher on the depth chart first.
Absolutely. That's why I'm saying fourth, fifth option as you file out your receiving core. Just like you could argue, hey, if you want to bring back a Darius Slayton and a Richie James, and we're talking about depth, then there's value there too, since they also have familiarity with the scheme. But the priority is you also want to infuse some new talent into the mix. Now, speaking of infusing new talent and new faces, I want to transition to something unrelated to the Giants, but does relate to them, and some movement we've seen in the NFC East. And this was something we wanted to tackle on Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. So for those of you keeping tally at home, this is the longest teaser in the history of Big Blue Kickoff Live. But we're finally going to respond and answer and fulfill the teaser. And that was that the Commanders officially hired Eric Bieniemy as their offensive coordinator and assistant head coach. And he spoke to the media. And this does impact the Giants, Paul, because they're going to see Washington twice. It's not Scott Turner's offense. They're handing the reins to a completely different individual. Coincidentally, Mike Kafka was with him in Kansas City. We saw what Kafka did for the Giants. Bieniemy is, of course, looking to make the same level of impact in Washington. And I'm interested, just from a pure football standpoint, to see what Bieniemy could do as the primary play caller. Because we've seen the narrative has been he's had an impact, but Andy Reid is at the controls. Well, look at the pre-snap motion, Paul, that they utilize. Look at how they tapped into all the different personnel, which was what we were talking about, right, with what Kafka could bring to the Giants. They've got Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, the rookie out of Penn State, Curtis Samuel, who's a guy you could use out of the backfield as a runner and a receiver, Brian Robinson, great story coming back from, unfortunately, the gunshot wound and really making a name for himself. They're not lacking weapons, is my point, in that offense. They got to find a quarterback. But Bieniemy's got some toys in the shed that he can definitely move around there.
Here's what's interesting. You mentioned the quarterback, and I think that's where it all starts for me because, you know, Ron Rivera has talked about how Sam Howell is the front runner going into the clubhouse right now. Well, when Howell came out of North Carolina, he was lauded for his ability to run the ball because in a lot of ways he's like Josh Allen. He's sturdy. He's built more like a tight end or a running back than he is a quarterback. And so when he was at North Carolina, you know, he ran for almost a dozen touchdowns his last year with the Tar Heels. I mean, he will take off, and he's strong, and he's fierce, and he's a competitor. He's smart. You know, he's got an average arm, but he's accurate. You know, so there are a lot of things that you can utilize with him. And some certainly because of his legs and his ability to do that kind of stuff, if you want to lean and gravitate towards having a more multiple, versatile quarterback attack, you could do that with him, probably more so than you could with Wentz or Heineke. Okay, at least I think so, because how really was a running quarterback to run. He ran forward. He wanted to become part of that rushing attack, not just a guy like Heineke who's trying to buy time to throw the ball. So I'm very interested to see what kind of philosophy Bieniemy brings to the Commanders in light of Howell's skill set.
I think that's an interesting point because Heineke had that mobility, but they didn't utilize him to the degree that Howell was used in UNC. And maybe that's something that Bieniemy does find attractive because Patrick Mahomes, I wouldn't consider him a running quarterback, Paul, but let's face it, there's games where they give him the green light, he takes off, and
Yes.
that can all of a sudden change field position, and the enemy has had that luxury over the course of the last few seasons. I also wonder if part of the conversation with them bringing him in is they spoke to him about how Patrick Mahomes was handled in 2017. Remember, Paul, I think a lot of people tend to forget Alex Smith was there when they drafted Mahomes. He did not play until the final week of that regular season. And remember, he played because the Chiefs locked up a playoff spot. They had nothing to gain from that last game, right? So they figured, all right, let's throw Mahomes out there and let him gain some experience. And then 2018, he takes over. The rest is history. Do they also look at Bieniemy's experience in Kansas City? And maybe this is why you shouldn't read so much into what Ron Rivera is talking about in January or February, because a lot changes, obviously, in the months ahead. But, and this is maybe me reading too much into it as well, but perhaps Howell is intriguing to them. They want to further develop him, but they still want to lean more on a veteran presence. And maybe it's not Wentz. Maybe Washington is one of those teams, Paul, that goes out, pursues a Derek Carr, tries to make a splash. They're just not wearing it on their sleeve right now. I would not rule that out.
You never know. I mean, look, there are probably a handful. All right. It depends on what you think of Mayfield and there are a couple of guys who are on the fringe.
Vets.
Right. There are but a couple of guys on the fringe who are under the Carr, Rodgers, Lamar Jackson. Then you get to Daniel Jones. And there's a couple of other guys there who are lower on the fringe who you could say, there's no reason why they couldn't start for somebody. Heck, I'll be perfectly frank with you. I'm still not convinced that Andy Dalton is done. I think Andy Dalton can still start in this league and do a pretty good job for somebody. But, he's kind of fallen out of the headlines for the time being. So, yeah, could they suddenly decide that they're going to get themselves into a negotiation with one of these veteran free agent quarterbacks that people aren't even thinking about, and we find out the guy suddenly lands there and is going to be their guy? It absolutely could happen.
Because you just wonder if Washington is in that crossroads situation, Paul. And what I mean by that is Ron Rivera, he's been there for a few seasons. They won the division one of the years. But of course, remember, that was the year where everybody in the NFC East was sub 500. So I don't know how much stock or substance you're putting in there. They were knocking on the door of the playoffs last year. Clearly, they made changes on the coaching staff because they're looking to upgrade. Is there more of an urgency, I guess, is what I'm getting at? And we've seen this from covering the league. Every team is different, where Ron Rivera is saying, hey, I need to show results this year. And in order to show results, we need to bring in the more proven quarterback, right? As opposed to, I've got the luxury of, we let Sam Howell take over, Eric Bieniemy comes in, we develop him. I'm just wondering if time is of the essence, is what I'm getting at, Paul, right now, to Ron Rivera's perspective.
Throw a potential ownership change into that equation.
That's another true. Absolutely.
And how does that kind of turn up the mix in another different way?
Well, I'm glad you went there because we don't know the timeline. Maybe ownership transfers over smack in the middle of the season. Maybe it happens before the season starts. Case in point, Paul, Denver had a transfer of ownership, right? We just saw the Broncos have a sale. And what happened? I'm not saying that this was the major influence why they went in a different direction, but Nathaniel Hackett only lasted one season, and they brought in Sean Payton as a result. Once again, different dynamics, Russell Wilson, high expectations. I don't want to say it was equivalent. It's just, let's not be naive. What we're getting at is there's a lot of influences and factors that determine what direction a team wants to go at quarterback. And Washington, I just feel they're a wild card team. A little bit unpredictable because I could see them go in different directions. And Bieniemy's presence also adds another layer to this because he's also, right, he's looking to prove himself, right? Isn't a big part of why he went to Washington, Paul? I want to show not only that I could be a head coach, but I can call the plays and make as much of an impact as Andy Reid.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. And it's interesting for me as I look at the Giants in this NFC East and I see Washington is really in a state of flux. I see that Philadelphia's got a bunch of veterans who are now in expired contracts, and they've got to figure out now how much turnover are they going to have from a team that went to the Super Bowl. Okay. They've also got to figure out, they've been talking about maybe giving Hurts an extension, which is going to cost them a pretty penny. Then you've got Dallas, which is already way over the salary cap, and they've got a lot of economic juggling to do. This division right now during the offseason is going to have a lot of volatility, Lance.
Which is nothing new when it comes to the NFC. So, Paul, are you telling me that I should not remove myself or separate myself from my favorite statistic, which is the fact that we're going to get another new division winner in 2023? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, I suspect the odds are pretty good that we're going to see some significant shuffling going on in 2023.
I would echo those sentiments. And just for good measure, remember, nobody's won back-to-back division titles in the NFC East since the Eagles won 4 in a row from 2001 to 2004. For those of you checking at home, it's now 2023. It has been quite some time, which is, of course, good news for the New York Giants as they are trying to build off a very impressive campaign in year one for Brian Daboll. All right, that is going to wrap up Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. Appreciate everybody tuning in. So here is what is on tap for the remainder of the week. Paul Dottino will be transferring his presence to Indianapolis as he will be making his presence felt at the Combine with John Schmelk. We'll have live shows Tuesday through Friday. Paul, do we have the specifics in terms of the times for each day on that front?
We will maintain our 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time 1-hour program throughout the course of the Combine, and we certainly look forward to folks. If you want to hit us up on Twitter, I don't know how many calls we'll be able to take because we'll have a lot of guests out there. But by all means, do go #GiantsChat on Twitter, and we'll see if we can filter those in.
So there you go. So stay locked to Giants.com as well as Big Blue Kickoff Live for all the latest coming out of Indianapolis at the Combine. And a reminder, when it comes to this program, it is part of the Giants platforms everywhere and Giants.com/podcast. For Paul Dottino, I'm Lance Medow. Thanks so much for tuning in to Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live, and we will speak to you from Indianapolis the rest of the week here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. Have a good one.